Welcome back to Season 2, Keanu's. Today, we will be talking about December Keanu with two films, Generation from 2012 and Knock Knock from 2015. Both of these films feature Keanu as an aging man set alongside or performing opposite two significantly younger women. There's a lot to talk about in these and explicit parallels between the two films. But before we begin, today I am not joined by Bob Thompson. Rather, I am joined by Lani Rich. Some of you may remember Lani from Romantic Keanu, which was episode 5 this season. And she has graciously offered to step in for my absent communication partner, Bob. Hey, Lani.
Hey, Charisse. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good. I think Bob's a little jealous, or at least he's worried that you might usurp his spot.
You know what? I don't think that he has much to worry about. I think that Bob and I serve very different, quarters of this thing. So he will be dearly, dearly missed today, but I will do my best to kind of fill those very, very serious shoes.
And I thank you so, so much for finding the time to continue these conversations. We, Bob and myself, as well as our listeners, have expressed how wonderful it was to have you on the podcast. So I am just so excited that you could come back and join me.
Oh my gosh, it's so much fun. And of course, you're being very sweet in that, I have been harassing Charisse, just a little pull back the curtain. I'm like, I want to come back. I want to talk more about Keanu. So I was very, very pleased when you said you had something for us to do and something to talk about. And these are interesting films.
Interesting, yes.
Yes.
Well, then before we even get started with our standard questions, what did you think of this pairing? And had you seen either of these films before?
I had not only not seen them, I hadn't even heard of them.
Yeah.
You told me about them, and I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. But then I got into watching them, and I have to say it was an interesting experience. Keanu has a range. There is a wide range to the kinds of things that he will do. And I find it fascinating from this perspective of the star study, because again, as I spoke about in Romantic Keanu, what I do is, I'm a story expert, I'm a narrative expert, and I look at what is in the text itself, what is happening in this story itself. The idea that the thing that is connecting these stories, this Keanu-ness, the fact that Keanu chose these things, is the thing that pulls them all together and sort of creates a sort of meta-narrative in its own. And I find this whole study so fascinating. And so to look at these movies and I'm looking them as independent narratives, but looking at these two in relation to each other, and then the entire, run that you guys have done during this season as this big kind of statement in Keanu, it's fascinating.
I really enjoyed watching these two as a pairing, because also the thing about it, and this is what I think is so exciting about this season on this podcast, is, sometimes we take two films that clearly go together, but sometimes we take two films that on their face don't necessarily go together. In this case, we've got a sort of, I believe the reviewer from Variety called Generation a slap-together sub-mumblecore exercise that at times suggests a feature-length expansion of 2010's sad Keanu meme. And Knock Knock, which is an erotic psychological thriller. Genre-wise, they are so different. But when you watch them together, the pairings are obvious. And for me, I was, for our listeners, I was toying with what to call this episode. I'm really happy with landing on December Keanu, primarily because both films feature the exact same question.
Wait, how old are you anyway?
How old are you?
Absolutely. And so, there's a Keanu that's acknowledging his aging, even though, of course, he never ages, right? That's part of the meme. That's part of the joke. But he knows that he's aging, and he's embracing that. I feel like there's something to be said for women as they get older in Hollywood. It's like suddenly you're no longer the love interest, you're the love interest's mom.
Right.
Now, admittedly, he is still the leading man and he is still the Keanu, but he also realizes that playing opposite younger women is something he needs to point his finger to, as opposed to other Hollywood stars who play against younger women unquestioningly.
Oh,
and
certainly.
suddenly we have these May-December romances, relationships, interactions on screen that are not addressed as such. And in this case, it's part of the character that he's playing, that he doesn't understand these other two women. And he's folding that into the narrative as opposed to it being the default.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you look historically at movies, I mean, we've had our Jimmy Stewart with Grace Kelly in Rear Window. No real mention of the huge age difference there. In Charade, we had Cary Grant with Audrey Hepburn, and there was a huge age difference, And so the younger woman with the older, established, and suave older man, right? Somebody who's in charge and who's like good at what he is. But here we have Keanu not just like subverting that trope, but also subverting the trope that this suave older man has his shit together, because this guy in both of them absolutely does not. I mean, in Knock Knock, I think we get a little bit of that where he seems like he's got it together. But of course, he unravels entirely throughout the process of that story. And in Generation he opens unraveled and stays unraveled the whole time.
I really appreciate that. In Knock Knock, he's literally holding it together.
Yes.
He has his shit together because he's actively holding it together. And then the girls poke and prod, and we see that he can't hold it together, much like a, cheap girdle. It falls apart. In Generation and I'd like to talk about Generation first. In Generation we see he lives in a hovel. And the reason I paused to use that word is because it's the exact same word I used when we talked about his apartment in Hardball, right? He lives in this terrible situation, or maybe it's a great situation. I don't know. The cousin clearly comes to live with him. So, but this apartment is falling apart. He uses a curtain, like just sheets to close off his privacy. His room is barren and bare, and he feels like a man-child.
Yes.
He's never really grown up. Regarding Generation who is Keanu's character in this movie, and what stands out to you?
His character in this movie is something I could not quite pin down, right? Because he's reactive. He's an incredibly reactive protagonist. One of the things that I teach in my story theory is that for a protagonist, we need to have a POV character, which we clearly have with John. We are in his perspective. We're seeing the world through his eyes for the most part in the movie. That he needs to have a goal that provides motive force. So he's in search of something and also has the most at stake if he loses. So one of the things about Generation is that it doesn't have this classic protagonist-based narrative, that we have a protagonist in pursuit of something and an antagonist blocking. What we have here would be a situation that seems to be an internal antagonist, where John is actually his own worst enemy, that whatever it is that he wants, which we are not, I think, at all clear on, he is actually blocking himself. And one of the things that I found interesting is as I was trying to figure out, what is it? What is the story narrative? Because not all films necessarily have a strong story base. Some films are meant to create a sense of verisimilitude. They're meant to create an experiential thing so that you're getting a sense of what it feels like to be this person without necessarily having a strong story base. But it was interesting to me because it almost seemed like it was him, like the child within versus the aging man that he could not possibly avoid. So he's going to lose. But yet when he steals that camera, we get this whole episode of pure childlike play. And so it feels like we have this fantasy idea of the ability to remain, to have that arrested development, to remain in adolescence, and yet at the same time while aging. and having to deal with the realities that presents. Living in this, like when you're in your 20s and you're sharing a crappy apartment in the city with somebody while you're pursuing your dreams.
That's the epitome of your 20s.
Exactly. I mean, that's kind of exactly what it should be. You should be living with a little, sheet drawn across, and that's all your privacy. This man is in his 40s, clearly, living like that with his, cousin who is in his 20s, who is appropriate to be living like that. And yet it doesn't seem like he is really invested or even worrying or even really thinking about whether or not this is a problem. He just simply seems to accept that fate. So he doesn't seem to be necessarily fighting against it. But when the opportunity comes up for him to engage in this kind of adolescent play, he runs toward that.
This movie for me really begins when he steals the camera.
Yeah.
Is literally a man with a movie camera coming back to Vertov, right? That, you made the point that we're seeing it from his point of view. We are seeing it from his point of view, but we're forced to see it from his point of view. He doesn't even know what his point of view is. Right. It's this fatalistic, we talk about, jaded Keanu, this fatalistic, the world is moving. I don't really have a place in it. It's my birthday. I don't care. My mother keeps calling me. I don't want to talk to her. He's just living this Gen X sort of disgusted with life, mm-hmm. and everything seems to just be good enough. And we have these moments where he has this deep philosophical introspection about his current situation. We have it in the voiceover. We have it in the diner mm-hmm. where he's talking to, I believe it's Charlie.
Charlie, yes.
So when you turn left, you're leaving. But when you turn right, you're coming home. It's almost like you have to come home to leave because you turn right.
There's this philosophical Keanu, and frankly, the whole series could be called the whole season could be called philosophical Keanu.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But in that, you're supposed to love that distancing. To be fair, that's not something we love in films. Mm-hmm. This film, I believe, has a 0 rating.
On Rotten Tomatoes. I looked that up.
Yeah. I think 20% liked it or maybe less.
It's 0 critical, 20% audience, which is almost an achievement in and of itself. Because I don't think I've ever seen, I'm sure there's another film on there somewhere, but I have never seen one that had a 0 critical rating.
And so for us to come at this with a critical perspective, we are looking for things to love.
Yes.
We are looking for things to love. We're looking for what Keanu loved mm-hmm. to bring him to this movie because he came on before all the other actors. Mm-hmm. I don't know where Angie Martinez fits into this, but I figure once you cast Angie Martinez, you better keep her in, right? She did not need to be in this. Who is Lizzie and why is she in an office? None of that made sense to me. But hey, Angie.
Okay.
And so the distancing, the construction of this character is so forced, but it's also to some degree a palate cleanser, mm-hmm. right? That maybe Keanu is ready to be in a mumblecore extension of his own meme, eating a cupcake in slow motion close up for mm-hmm. 3 solid minutes.
Right.
If that's not experimental, I don't know what is.
Yeah, no, it really is. And the thing is that trying to kind of wrestle this thing into a space where it can be understood as opposed to experienced. This is something that you just step into his world and you ride along with him and whatever happens, happens. That's just kind of the way that it is. But it was interesting to me the way that we have this character who is in something that we would. I'm, a little bit younger than Keanu, but not a ton younger than Keanu. So we are of a similar generation. And so it's something that if I was living like that at my age, I would be incredibly dissatisfied with that reality. He does not seem incredibly dissatisfied. He doesn't seem terribly motivated to change anything. He's just kind of living with it. But he also, aside from a couple of grumbly, asides.
I wish rent ran in the family.
he doesn't really express enough displeasure with his lot in life. He just rolls with it. There's something about, like, at the same way that we are experiencing this with him, he is experiencing it himself. And he doesn't seem particularly happy, but he's also not, you know...
He's not searching for a better life.
He doesn't seem in search of anything. But then the camera comes in.
And he stares at squirrels.
He's playful.
Yeah.
He's a child. Like, it is this child that is unable to exist in this, like, to meet these adult requirements, these requirements of adulthood, that you get a job that pays you well enough that you can live a decent life and maybe have a car, you know, like, this kind of thing. And yet, so he lives in this adult space and it's miserable. But when he's in this childhood space, he's chasing squirrels. He's taking this camera that he stole, you know, and I mean, even as he's stealing it, you can see the joy
in the run.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the first time in this movie you see any joy from him, and it is so childlike in its expression. And I find that really interesting. And so that to me was what drew me into the film. Up until then, I was like, yeah, this is really not doing anything for me, you know? And when he starts going in and then creating exactly what we have in this film, this verisimilitude, this cinema veritas with his girlfriends, right? That he's sitting there and he's doing this, the shoot with them. And of course, Violet is putting on a show. She's doing this whole performative thing.
Mia Moo, hi.
Hi.
Welcome to my show.
Oh, and stick the cigarette back in your mouth.
She's pulling in the mirror. She's like changing the, you know, she's controlling everything. He's just capturing everything as it happens. And if she wants to perform, she can perform, but he's not performing. He's not building anything. He's just experiencing it and capturing it. And that was, I think, like the really interesting core of this movie for me was that, you know, not a big sense of judgment, not a huge sense of dissatisfaction, but this childlike play space is the only space where he can be genuinely who he is.
I thought it was particularly interesting when you get glimpses of who John, that's his character's name, is outside of this relationship with these girls and to some degree his younger cousin. There's one piece that is kind of thrown away, but it's his love of technology. And you see him take that television so that he can take it apart and play with it. There's another scene where he's playing with wires in his bedroom. And then when the cousin drops the television, he's like, yeah, that was broken to begin with, right? So the camera, his stealing of the camera is both an opportunity for him to play and have joy, but I also feel it is an extension of his technophilia that we only ever get glimpses of.
Right.
So we don't really know what he did before or why he loves technology, but I think that that's an important piece. Last time, Bob and I talked about Keanu, which is Man of Tai Chi and 47 Ronin. Man of Tai Chi is his directorial debut. That came out in 2013. So he had this moment. It was the first time he ever held a camera that, you know, he was playing director. And then lo and behold, he turns around technically a year later. I'm not quite sure what the actual production calendar is, but he then turns around and makes his own movie. So in that joy we see in John, the character, I think, is paralleling the joy that Keanu is feeling by playing with the camera and realizing, hey, I want to go and tell this story of Tiger Chen. And he goes and he picks up a camera. Like, that, I think, is so Keanu, where he's introduced to something, to come back to Siddhartha and Buddhism, right? The Matrix and martial arts. He's introduced to something through one job, through one film, and he throws himself into it completely and then takes that into a different direction. So I really enjoyed watching this, and I've got a couple other points about why I enjoyed it, but it also it was kind of foreshadowing his directorial debut. One of the other things I came to love it. That's an overstatement. I came to enjoy this because it felt like Keanu's New York. Yes. That's what I was watching, Keanu's New York. And Keanu lives in New York. He's on the subway all the time. You know, he's just moving through life there. Now, admittedly, I'm certain he does not live in an apartment like that. But much like kids, right, where we are watching what a day in August in New York City is for these teenagers, here we are watching what a day in New York could be or looks like for Keanu as he constructs the lens of John, who is driving these women. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, if that's what it is, A, it didn't have to be an hour, 45 minutes. But B, there's something to be said for a Veritas exploration of a city, right? There's those close-up wrought irons. There's that shot of the dog park. There's him on the subway. Like, it's just a hodgepodge. It may be a hodgepodge of mumblecore, but I think it's also a hodgepodge of Keanu's New York. And that is a movie I would like to see. It's a movie I enjoyed seeing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it does really get that experience across. Like, one of the things, you know, when I'm talking to my students about filmmaking is that it's not about what it literally looks like. It's about that you have to express how it feels.
What it feels like.
You know? And I think that when you get into like cinema veritas, when you get into this like truth-telling, you know, expression, you're getting both, you know, what it feels like and what it actually is. Because we're not moving this narrative. We're not injecting this narrative. One of the things you do with narrative is you take the essence of whatever the story is and you kind of filter out all the white noise. But when you're doing something with Veritas, the white noise is part of the story.
Yes.
Like everything that exists within that space, down to the random, you know, sheets that are pulled across to, you know, substitute for a door.
Or the couple making love or having sex on the other side of the wall that he tries to peek in through the fire escape.
Which is also such a childlike thing to do. I mean, all of it.
I apologize. I cut you off. Down to the sheets.
Yeah, no, I was just that this experience is very much both what it actually looks like and what it feels like pulled together, because that's where you get the Veritas experience from. So I did really enjoy that with this particular film, although there were parts of it that were a little difficult. The girls.
The Queen of Denmark. The Queen of Denmark.
Get out.
She was
As much as like this is about his experience with them, Violet was truly dreadful. And in the opening, we have a situation, and we're going to revisit this again in Knock Knock, where we essentially have a rape scene, you know? And so we have this...
in this case, you're talking about the scene in the bar.
The scene in the bar in the bathroom, right?
Stop it. Jesus, why do you always have to...
Behave.
Fine.
And he shuts down and he allows it to happen, which is how rape happens, you know, because there's a certain point where you can't fight anymore and you shut down and you just let it, you know. So watching that for me, and then of course we're going to revisit another take on that experience in Knock Knock, was a little upsetting, and it made me really not like this woman. On top of which she was truly, truly awful for most of it, you know. And then until we get into these stories at the end where we're really visiting we're kind of getting past that performative where she's, you know, sticking her ass out for the camera and doing all that stuff, and they're all drinking wine and they're just talking.
Telling her how you felt about all of this?
It's too late. It's too late for that.
Obviously. Because if there were an ideal, I would be with that person.
I've cried all my tears. I've, stayed up all night.
You know, and they're just telling their stories and they're sharing vulnerability. And that is how you connect with these characters.
One of the things I really wanted to bring up, and the movie was spoiled for me.
Okay.
And by spoiled, I mean literally spoilers. Because, and all of our listeners by now should know that all movies will be spoiled in these conversations. Yes. But in all of the descriptions of this film, in all of the reviews, and all of the Wikipedia pages and everything, we know from the jump that he is a driver for an escort service.
Yes.
So from the very beginning, you know these girls are working girls. You know that they work as prostitutes. And so you're seeing that foreshadowing through the whole thing because you're expecting it. As I was reading the notes on why Keanu adopted or came into this story, and the girls as well, for them, the ending was a reveal. At no point do you know that they're working as prostitutes. There's some indication, like I said, there's some foreshadowing. They say he's a terrible driver. You know, there's bits and pieces here, but it's not given away. in none of the write-ups of it did anybody realize that they were literally spoiling the film for the viewer. Because Keanu says in interviews regarding the film, the ending, the reveal in the ending is what brought him to this story. He didn't see that coming. And that was emotionally effective. The reveal that these are girls who are working as prostitutes.
Hey, who's Mr. Big tonight? Lizzie, anything else is extra, okay? Cash. Okay, who's the bro?
As we watch the whole film, they're framed as party girls. They're framed as annoying 20-something party girls, right down to when Violet says, I think she looks up to me. Right. That moment, anytime you hear somebody says, I think so-and-so looks up to me, you're like, you're full of yourself and you need to go away now. So if we were to look at this film without knowing that piece of information at the end, I feel like we have a very different film. And I'll tell you why. It's because in most stories, the prostitute doesn't have a backstory. They come in simply to serve the Johns, which now his name is John. This is a thing. They come in to serve the John. They are simply a prop for the story of the person who samples their services. Obviously, we can talk about the different ones, the trope of a hooker with a heart of gold, pretty woman, so on and so forth. But in this story, you don't find out they're working until after you have developed an attitude towards them. Right. Until you've already begun to hate her for whatever reason. You know, you learn about Mia's troubled family life. Like, you learn about them before you learn what they do. Right. And that is not the way sex workers are framed in movies or just the American narrative at all. I'm thinking about journalism. I'm thinking about when prostitutes get killed, right? They are framed as sex workers and prostitutes first, not 20-something party girls who went down a path.
Right. Well, and it's a primary identifier, right? If you are a sex worker, you are that before everything else. And most often when we tell the sex worker narrative, look at how she gets out of it. Yeah. Look at how she rises above this experience rather than this is just what she does. Yeah. You know, because there is a certain level of sexual empowerment, which we are very uncomfortable with in women. And sexual empowerment's not a problem for me. The forcing him to accept her sexual stuff.
You know, that's a different narrative.
That's a different thing entirely, like that. And especially coming from her. And I was not spoiled. I went into this no idea. So when I saw the scene,
because I could have sworn I told you. All right, cool. I feel less bad.
You might have mentioned it, but if you mentioned it, it was something that didn't stick with me. Because until we got to that scene, you know, where I saw that they were working, it's really funny because it didn't really change my opinion or my feeling. I was like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. You know, like that's the job they do. And then I realized, of course, that he was their, like, that was his job, that he was their driver, that he took them from place to place, you know. That was fine because it pulled together for me this connection between him and these girls. In the beginning, I thought they were his, like, girlfriends. I thought that they were his...
Some kind of poly
and that there's
thruple.
some kind of... Yeah, there's some kind of thing going on there, and I really wasn't sure, but it seemed like a really abusive relationship to me. Yeah. And Violet was very difficult for me to connect with. Mia was not so bad, and we got her vulnerability in I think, much larger doses than we did from Violet. And that vulnerability makes you able to connect with those characters. So when Mia's telling the story of how her mother had lost the baby and all of that.
Or the baby was taken from her, I feel loss is a little too passive in that context.
It really is. Yeah. It really is. That's a terrible story. And she said, I think she was 6 at that time when that happened, you know.
She'd just given birth, but the baby was dead. And there was a baby girl. She was dead. Yeah, the beating to her stomach killed her.
You know, what a thing to experience. But again, like it feeds into this, all sex workers must have been damaged in childhood. All sex workers must be wanting to find something else.
It was cliche, even though it was looking at the opposite side of the cliche. I want to come back to the bathroom scene just for a second because... And we've talked about it before, and Sheila Johnson mentions it explicitly in the book, that Keanu Reeves is a passive sex object. Yeah. That sex continuously happens to him. Women are on him. He is rarely the one who is pursuing. And when he pursues, those bodies are often in parallel. Think Point Break.
Right.
You know, Cop Keanu, I guess, Point Break and Speed, right? That there's a twinning of the bodies in both of those. But when it's a sex scene, it's usually the woman either demanding sex from him, or as we see in both of these films, not just demanding, but taking.
Yes.
Right? And so as we think through what our leading man is and how Keanu Reeves scuttles this, I think that this adds to our understanding of Keanu that we don't talk about, which is that he is a sex symbol, but he is a passive sex symbol. And there's definitely a narrative to be said about the stereotype or the framing of Asian men and the way in which we, as a culture, American culture, is uncomfortable with them in being a proactively sexual position. But I think in this case, it takes it to a point that is not the same as Feeling Minnesota. Although, having said that, Feeling Minnesota was kind of rapey.
On a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
You know, Feeling Minnesota is like a 3. You know, this is like a 7, you know. And all
Knock
of
Knock
it.
is like a 10.
Knock Knock is
Definitely
Knock,
the second
We're
scene.
going to have some discussions
Okay.
about Knock Knock because that is, the second one absolutely is a full 10.
Yeah.
But that's also an interesting kind of construction. But this idea that he is sexually passive, and as I'm thinking about like all the Keanu movies I've seen, which not as many as you have, of course, but you're right. Like there is this sense of sexual passivity from him, that he is not the aggressor. Very often, I'm trying to think of if ever, and I think in the most assertive space for him sexually, it's always this completely mutual. She's coming at him too,
Right?
You know, like I don't know that I've seen anything in which he is like a hot pursuer of women, and that is a really interesting thing because as you see this happen over and over and over again in these films, is this something that he is specifically choosing because he's more comfortable being passive? Is this something that happens to movies that he's in because we are more comfortable portraying him in a more passive way? I'm not really sure.
In an interview with Elle magazine on for Knock Knock, he says, on misunderstood gender lines, men are vulnerable and emotional creatures. And throughout his career, he has toyed with other people's assumptions of his sexuality, right? He is not afraid to be labeled gay, even though he says he's not. I believe the response is probably not, right? That, you know, in all of those interactions, he refuses to give you. We had this conversation in class. It was really lovely. One student said, you know, what is the problem with the word straight, right? It feels weird. And I'm like, because it's absolute, right? There's no wiggle room. If you are straight, you cannot look at another man and say, that is an attractive man. Like you are no longer straight, right? So for him to constantly play in these spaces, it comes through in the roles he's willing to take. He understands that men are emotional creatures. And most of our leading men definitely either cannot show that or have to show it in a very structured manner. And so I think that that's telling in the roles that he chooses to take, that we do not see men as passive sex objects, and he's willing to take those roles.
I find that really interesting, and this is one of the things that I absolutely love about him, because culturally in our storytelling, we have very specific requirements of men, right? They must be assertive. They can't be emotional. They can't have real vulnerability. They can't cry. They can't have a range, right?
They get one tear when something ridiculously awful has happened.
Right. The death of their wife and daughter is usually motivating them to go through the story and do whatever else they've got to do. But with Keanu, he is I think, in search of and really embracing these roles that allow for him as a major leading man, which most, and this is the thing I love about him, most people at his level of stardom, at his level of power, at his level of influence, right? They're taking the Ocean's 11. They're being more manly than man can ever be. They're taking the masculinity roller coaster and just riding it all the way, right? And he actually is challenging exactly those kinds of presumptions and tropes. And I really kind of like that about him, because with his power, when Keanu Reeves is in a movie, you pay attention to that movie, which otherwise may not have gotten that kind of attention. And he may actually be on his own moving that toxic masculinity needle, you know, shoving it, doing a Sisyphusian task, bringing it up the hill and letting it drop back down.
I'll just make this point. I think it's really interesting that you use the, sadly enough, cliche that when he loses his wife and daughter, that's what drives the story. When Keanu in real life lost his wife and daughter, right? And, you know, I think that's a piece that we don't often talk about, and rightly so. The man deserves his own private life. But if that is the way in which men on film get to be vulnerable.
Yes.
This is something that he has gone through in his own personal life. And I don't think they were married, so whatever, partner and daughter.
Right.
This is something he's gone through in his own life. So he doesn't need to play that on film. He doesn't need to do the Taken, if you will. Right? He doesn't need to go through that cliche, because he's lived that, which allows him to be more than what we expect from that. I really want to draw attention to the fact that that is a cliche that Keanu doesn't need to waste his time with.
Yeah, no, and it's one of those things too, because we are so specific about the ways in which we will allow men to be vulnerable, right? And it is always that, and the frequency in which we have characters whose wives, daughters, whatever, have been killed. We kill women solely for the purpose of motivating men. There's actually a term for that. It's called fridging, from comic books in which one of the main characters, found his wife in a fridge, and she had been killed solely to motivate his story. And we see women killed often just to motivate male stories. So for Keanu, given this very real personal experience that he had, when I can only imagine, and again, that is his personal life, and we're not going to, necessarily really dig that far into it, but I can only imagine what that must be like, looking at the scripts that will come across his desk on a regular basis, that since this is one of the only ways in which we allow men to be vulnerable, and so if we need a man to be vulnerable, we're going to go back to that space, and this is a space that he has visited in reality. That's not the kind of vulnerability maybe that he wants to explore. So we get this kind of experience with John.
Now we're having a conversation about gendered narratives and what stories are written for men, and obviously much more diverse than the stories for women, but that he has seen those stories, right? And he has opted out of those stories. Having said that, in the case of women, the rape of a woman becomes a driving factor in many narratives that are female-centric. And knowing the statistics of abuse, rape for women, I don't know. I don't have much to say about it, but there's something to be said for seeing your own story commodified in that fashion.
Yes.
And the frustration that I feel 1/3 of women must experience. Keanu may feel and experience that same frustration. And admittedly, it's 1 in 6, I believe, men have been sexually abused as children, but that's not a narrative trope.
No. We don't go to that. We don't talk about that.
Exactly. So there's something to be said for knocking stories off your desk that you don't want to relive. Or you don't want to commodify.
That you don't want to, absolutely. And the thing is that there is a difference. Story has this incredible power to be able to be truly healing in trauma, right? One of the things that I talk about a lot in my work is the earning of that, right? If you're going to talk about rape, earn it. talk about it. If you're going to, go to somebody whose wife and child are killed, then earn it. You're not just using it to motivate our sex worker. You're not just using it to motivate our hero who's going to go out and shoot a bunch of people or whatever, that when you're visiting these things, stories can have an incredible healing power, but a lot of times we take the emotional charge that comes from those backstories and we simply, use that. We steal that charge without really paying for it by dealing with it properly within the stories themselves.
I enjoyed John talking to the camera. So when he's in the car and he's shooting his car, and then we come to learn that it's because the women are working and he got pushed away from the hotel. Like the way they cut that timeline, I really appreciate in a sort of Pulp Fiction way. Like, what comes first? What am I watching? I don't know. When he turns the camera to talk to himself, there's something so beautiful about that moment because he's talking to the camera when we see that the relationships that he's in, nobody listens to him. Yeah. Right? And so the camera will listen to him. But at the same time, he's not answering calls from his mother. Maybe his mother won't listen to him either. Maybe she's calling to talk at him as opposed to speaking with him. But I do want to make this point. I really enjoyed the end credits of Generation
Yes. The pasta dinner.
Wasn't it good? Wasn't it good?
Amazing.
It's my specialty.
Now we're turning around the lens.
I have a question to ask.
Yeah.
We've got a few questions, babe. All right.
Because it closes on a very depressing moment. And like Eric Clapton's Layla, right? It takes off into this beautiful moment where they eventually go back to the apartment. They've never been to his apartment before. The four of them have a delightful evening. Yeah. And the camera is again a character, and it captures this just coming back sheer joy that sweetens what would be a very depressing end. And it's not depressing because they went to work. It's depressing because now you see the two of them in the back. The whole thing is dark. It's nighttime. They give them the money. Nobody says anything. It's just silence. So I really enjoyed that last credit scene. I wanted to give a little moment to that because it just seemed out of character for the overall film.
Yeah, no, it was. It stood out because it did have that sense of joyful play, and it was really kind of a fun thing to watch. And one of the things I liked about Generation is that we do have those book ending scenes, right? We open he's in the front, he's driving the car in the morning, and he's driving the car at the end of the day. We kind of have those bookend reflective scenes on each other. But then we move into this kind of fun community, with his cousin as well. Right. So where everybody was kind of talking at, before, whenever they spoke, they seemed to speak at each other rather than to each other. This seemed like genuine connection. The only thing that allowed them really to speak to each other was through the medium of the camera. They would speak to each other through the camera. But then in this last scene, it does feel so weird, kind of out of the space of the rest of the film, but it is joyful. It is happy. And that was kind of nice.
One of the things I enjoyed across both of these was the generational play. And I feel like that last scene just screams Gen X, mid-90s. Everybody's got a cheap video camera now. And so we're just going to look at, it's like the era of the real world, right? And we're going to have fun. And we don't know if that fun is real. We see it's more real than the other times in the body of the movie. Yeah. But it's also very silly. Having said that, the HBO review by Robert Silva on Knock Knock says what follows is not only a psychic game of cat and mouse, but a gratifying cage match between millennials and Gen Xers. And I think that intergenerational battle, which is really what brings me to this being December, Keanu, that battle is subdued in Generation but it's very much there. And if you missed it, I think it's evident, that play is evident in the last scene.
Yes.
So let's talk about Knock Knock, because there's a lot happening in Knock Knock. There's a lot of parallels. But whereas Generation is I mean, if we're going to call it character driven, right? Like, I don't know who's driving because it's definitely not John Wall.
Character-centric
Narrative.
Yeah.
Knock Knock is clearly plot driven. Mm-hmm. And so now we've got a story that's being told. And again, Keanu has said that is a story that he hadn't seen before.
Right.
Specifically that, and I love, and we'll get to it, that his like derailed monologue at the end where he compares to this entire affair to free pizza. Right? That, you know, he's faced in this like softcore porn setup.
Yeah.
These two young, attractive party girls, in this case, show up to go to a party, soaked, and throw themselves at him.
Yes?
We're so sorry to bother you, sir, but could you please tell us where the Gregorys live? This is the third house we've tried. Looks like everyone's gone for the long weekend. Surprise!
What the fuck are you doing?
Come on, Evan, join us. Yeah, join
The family and the wife are gone for the weekend, so he has sex with them. Under this presumption that there will be no strings attached.
Yeah.
And he has said that he liked the story because it's not something you see. You don't see characters being held accountable for their decisions. And in this movie, they hold him accountable in the extreme.
Yes.
But in the end, he did decide to cheat on his wife in his family's home. And that was a choice that he made. And now he's being held accountable in a, over-the-top fashion. So he said he appreciated that story. He hadn't seen that story before, and that's what brought him to this film. And he is executive producer on it as well. So he was clearly committed to this story being made.
Yeah.
So let's begin. Who is Keanu Reeves in Knock Knock, and what does he bring to this character?
Keanu is the grown man, capital G, capital M, right? He's got his family, he's got his home. His wife is successful, his children are beautiful. Like, he wakes up in the morning and he's got cake.
Right, kids?
Right, so we have Keanu eats cake, right?
Yes.
So we've got this celebration, and it's a celebration of him, right? Father's Day versus birthday, right? We are in both of these movies celebrating Keanu.
Very nice.
Yes, thank you very much. So we have this, he is the opposite, and I can't look at this. I watched this second to after Generation and Generation influenced my experience of this so
As it
much.
should. That's the whole point of a star study.
Because we have this arrested development in John, right, where he is this child within, right, and here we have in Evan this grown-ass man, right, where he's grown, he's got everything together, and it's not even like that there's a child, but that there is the tamed domestic man and the wild man who takes his free pizza, like the difference and the internal battle between those two, between what the man does because it looks good on paper and what the man actually wants to do. And what he actually wants to do is absolutely, have loads of sex with these women. Like, that's what this internal. So we have this internal thing in John between the unwilling adult and this desire for childhood. And then in Evan, we have these two brands of adult, the one that wants what it wants and is an animal. The id, versus this carefully constructed, almost fantasy. And we do have in this that rape fantasy, right? Because in the beginning, when they start the sexual encounter, he says no, right? And you only should have to say no once. He had to say no a number of times, and then he was like, well, okay,
Yeah.
And then we went into that. So that is a kind of a rape fantasy in which you did try to say no, you did try to resist, but what are you going to do? And even in his misogynistic rant, the vagina dentata fantasy that we're going to talk about in a little bit, at the end, what was I supposed to do?
It was free pizza! Free fucking pizza! It just shows up at my fucking door! What am I supposed to do?
Like, it is unreasonable to expect that he would be able to maintain his faithfulness to his family and to put his family first. Meanwhile, while these women are destroying the absolute representation of family, this doesn't happen on a business trip.
Right.
They go, he's home in this absolute representation of this, constructed life that he's built that is not genuine to who he is. Who he is genuinely, we see during that shouting, screaming thing at the end.
And the girls say explicitly,
There's Evan. There he is.
We missed you.
I think there's a couple cues to the duality of Evan. One is in that very first scene where he's in bed with his beautiful wife before the kids and the cake come in, and we hear that they're about to have sex. The kids and the cake come in. As they're walking towards the door, we find out they haven't had sex in 3 weeks, right? There's just that one little throwaway line, but it also rationalizes his succumbing, quote unquote, to these women. And again, consent is, I don't want to say is not, I want to say is not given. It is given, but you're right. There's that pushing over and over and over, and he knows what he's supposed to do. But given that he hasn't had sex in 3 weeks, that he wanted to be a DJ, right? We're not talking about him wanting to be a doctor and then becoming an architect. He wanted to be a DJ. Right. And there's a lot of associations we have with what it means to be a party boy.
Yes.
Right? We're talking about these party girls. We need to talk about, him as a party boy. So together, these two films also look like, and I appreciate you bringing this up, Evan, bizarro Evan is totally John, right? Like in this opposite universe where you didn't meet this lovely artist woman and didn't have these beautiful children, and you stuck with being a DJ, and you might have paired up with these party girls who need a driver, and you can pick up 10% of their income by driving them, again, two roads diverged.
Yes, alternate universe.
Yeah. I appreciate who is Keanu in Knock Knock. The rape is tricky. There's a lot of Lolita, absolutely rape fantasies, right? Having said that, there is this weird flip, because when we talk about rape fantasies, we often talk about women, right? That she said no, but she really meant yes. There's also the fear that women will have sex with you and then turn around and say that they didn't. And they deploy that in order to get him to be afraid, right? They chased after him. We watched them chase after him.
What the fuck are you talking about?
15 to 20 years?
I think it is 20. 15 gets you 20, right?
I don't believe it.
You don't have to. The jury will. Statutory rape, Evan. 20 years behind bars. And that's just for one of us.
And I'm not planning on taking a shower. I have evidence.
And I think that there's, again, pushing back on these narratives we know, but also at the same time, is it just kind of reinforcing the narrative that we're afraid of? That beautiful women will always come back and accuse you of rape even when they liked it in the moment. Does that make sense?
Right. No, absolutely. And the thing is that this is where we go. We go into this vagina dentata narrative, right? With the dangerous...
For our listeners, why don't you tell us what a vagina dentata, vaginal dentata is?
It's teeth in the vagina that will bite off your penis. Basically, and in this brand of narrative, it comes down to this essential, what is at the core of essential misogyny, is that women are dangerous, that women cannot be trusted, that women will ruin your life, that you can't be held responsible for wanting to have sex with them because they are beautiful. And it is their very existence which is essentially antagonistic to the men because it brings them down. Their vagina is so irresistible that they cannot help themselves. And then when they ruin everything so that they can have it, it actually becomes the woman's fault. And so here we have this rape fantasy, right? And rape fantasy is all about being allowed to have sex without having the cultural responsibility for it. And we do usually see that in women because it's mostly women who are chastised for their desire to have sex. They are not supposed to want sex. So rape is kind of the rape fantasy as opposed to actual rape. Those are different things. This is rape fantasy narrative that we're talking about, not actual rape issues. But so in these rape fantasy narratives, if you say no, 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 and then are taken anyway and enjoy it, you cannot be held responsible for it. And women, the ways in which they are held responsible for sex is much, much more damaging to them typically than it is for men. Now, men in this particular domesticated situation in which they are with a woman, this wonderful woman in this wonderful life, and they've built everything and they've got these kids, and the fact that they still want to be with other women, that's what they have to, that's the judgment that they want to avoid the consequence for, So it's that they really do want this sexual experience, but they don't want to be held responsible for it. So when you have two beautiful women, two beautiful, very young women who throw themselves at a very handsome but aging Keanu, right? This fantasy that these young women are going to want nothing more than to be with your middle-aged domesticated ass, right? That this is this huge fantasy, and having the consequences for it, having to live with the consequences for it, is something that is not part of that, because this is male entitlement, right? I should be able to have these young girls. I should be able to have my free pizza. I should be able to do whatever I want, however I want to, and not have to have the consequences for it, not have to face that. That comes from this essential male entitlement, which we see culturally out there when we're talking about like the incel culture and all of that kind of thing. There's a lot of that male entitlement out there. And so the male narrative struggling with this idea of what they are entitled to and what they actually have to earn, it becomes that inner conflict. And we're seeing this played out in this movie in a way, the screaming at the end.
You fucking horse! You fucking horse! I'll fucking kill you, you fucking
the spittle, spewing fury that he has represents that exact layer of rage underneath men who are not getting what they were told they were entitled to, who were sold a bill of goods and now don't and are not getting what they thought they should get and they feel entitled to. It is such an accurate representation of that I cannot decide if this is a misogynistic movie or a feminist movie.
Absolutely. That indecision about what this film is doing, I am behind completely. Is it a commentary on male entitlement? Is it a commentary on what we think about rape fantasies? Is it reinforcing women as hysterical? Is it all of these things are there, as is the difficulty with any satire. And I'll make a point to say that the critical reception on this was wildly disparate. It was bimodal. There were the people who really loved it. There were people who really, really hated it. And let's see here. I'll just read the whole thing. Rotten Tomatoes reports a rating of 36% based on 69 reviews with an average rating of 5.7. The site's consensus states, Knock Knock brings a lot of talent to bear on its satirical approach to torture horror, but not effective enough to overcome the repetitive story or misguided campiness. If we see this as satire, the struggle with satire is who sees the joke and who is reinforced with their original beliefs to which they came to this content. Archie Bunker for president. Right?
Yes.
Those 4 words encompass a historical problem we have with satire. And absolutely, that last scene for me, it's not the last scene, but that monologue where he pulls back the veneer of put together man who simply ate the free pizza that came to his door, and he becomes this ranting, misogynistic, vile, hateful man towards these 2 women. That is something we have not seen from Keanu before. We have, I was racking my brain to see when we hear him string together 4 sentences in a row,
right?
Not counting My Own Private Idaho, which is, Shakespearean soliloquies.
Right.
But in the sort of modern day films, we don't see that. Bob and I both really enjoyed that same emotional breakdown that we see in Johnny Mnemonic, where he's not getting what he wants. He's like, all I want is a $10,000 hooker. I want my shirts laundered, right, that they do at the Mandarin Hotel, right? We're having that same conversation here. And because it is so off-brand for Keanu, he is a man of few words, for him to embrace this hateful monologue forces the audience to think twice about that monologue.
Yeah.
The question comes down to, does that monologue make sense because these women are hysterical and therefore he's right? Or is the monologue read as, is this what men are really like? And what kind of commentary is Eli Roth trying to make here?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I was of two minds on this one the whole time. Although when we got to the very end and they bury him and they show him his Facebook, that I started laughing.
No, it was played for laughs at the end of this thing.
Which is why it felt satirical in our common understanding of satire is funny.
You know, you really should be more careful with Facebook. If you don't log out, someone could do terrible things with it. Post something really personal for all your friends to see.
Satire does not have to be funny.
Right.
But that was a moment where I was like, all right, fine, I get it.
Yeah.
This is hilarious. And you see the comments coming up. I'm like, and then he goes to try and delete it and he likes it.
He likes it. I laughed. Yes, no, I did too. And the thing is that the tone of those last couple of seconds, and then his wife, we just see her reaction when she comes home and finds the house like that, and the kids are looking around, you know.
And the little boy says, Daddy had a party.
Daddy had a party. It's so tonally, it feels so off from the rest of, because the rest of the film is this like psychological horror, you know, and you're going through all and you're trying to decide are we supposed to be on his side? Are we supposed to be sympathizing with him? Or are we supposed to be sympathizing with the point that these women are making, which they say?
You know what's funny? They never say no. No matter who they are, no matter how much they love their families, you're all the same.
And they were watching him before this. They'd been setting this up for a long time, waiting for the moment to strike this guy, right? That this is what they do. They kind of take this extreme experience to hold a mirror up to these guys that think they're good guys.
I let you in. I was a good guy. I'm a good father. And you just fucking fucked me? What? Now you're gonna kill me? You're gonna kill me? Why? Why? You should fuck me? What the fuck? Fuck, this is fucking insane!
I mean, that whole thing, you know, establishing his identity as a good man while screaming, you know, these misogynistic, you know, epithets at these women. Now, granted, what the women have done is really terrible. And when we look at it, it reinforces that vagina dentata, you know, narrative. This dangerous woman who will do all these terrible things and ruin my life. And honestly, not to get too political with it, but I saw in that wild, raging monologue shades of Brett Kavanaugh during his questioning that I'm entitled to this and this woman is not going to ruin in my life, you know? So it's something that we've seen, although this comes before the Brett Kavanaugh experience where we saw it, you know, broadcast live on the news channels, you know? But this is a very real thing that is out there. And what these women did was they kept scratching at the surface of this guy until they could see what he really was, until he revealed what he really was. So in the end, given the way it ends, and we tell what a story is by the way it ends, right? Once we're at the end, we can tell what it meant. And the fact that we have this moment where he is stuck, cannot move, and is faced with the reflection of himself, of the reality. I mean, it was his rape. That was the actual rape experience that they were showing. That disturbed me, you know, on a level, because the first time it wasn't actually rape. It was like, oh, no.
They could have set the camera up in the bathroom.
Right,
Yeah.
right. They could have set the camera. But this was when she actually rapes him. He's tied up and he cannot control his response. You know, I mean, that you can certainly understand as an actual rape. So that was disturbing. Had it been the one that he was willingly, you know, involved in, then I would have felt a little bit better about that. But then the way that it becomes funny that he accidentally likes his own thing because he's so tied up in all of his mistakes, the binding and the dirt. That's all of his mistakes holding him down. And the only thing he can do is like his own downfall, you know. So that in and of itself would indicate to me that what we are doing is really putting a mirror up to society's misogyny. And I think in the end, that's where it comes. But we have so much vagina dentata narrative in this that it was really hard until that final moment. I was like, I don't know if I like or hate this. I don't know how I feel about it.
Yeah. Having said that, that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. I feel like this is what I appreciate about critical conversations about any content is in the U.S., we either like something or we don't like something. We rarely talk about why we like something or why we don't like something, because any nebulous area, any gray area is not necessarily good, even though life is filled with gray areas. So, walking away from that film, I really liked that spitting misogynistic monologue. I thought it was well done. I thought it was an exploration for Keanu that we had not seen before. Having said that, he says that he enjoyed playing the victim, which now in this conversation we see you are not the victim.
Yeah.
You participated in this, and now you're being held accountable, and that is supposedly victimhood.
Right.
But he said, the victim is fun in movies. Eli created a great situation of trust. Lorenza, Anna, and I had such love for the material and rehearsed in the house for a week. There's a seduction, but there's also comedy, thriller, and emotional scenes. We had fun doing that, right? So, here we have a man who has played the hero, the reluctant hero, but in this case, he is not the hero. Even though he's the hero of his family, he's the hero of his own narrative that he has created. And then these girls come in and literally knock that narrative over and show you what's underneath.
Yeah.
I hadn't seen either of these films, but I'm really glad to have watched them together.
Yeah.
I think we see the range of Keanu, although I just have to make this point. Apparently, December Keanu is a bearded Keanu.
Apparently.
December Keanu also loves animals, right? So the cat.
Yeah.
He loves animals, but those animals he doesn't get to keep, right? So the cat in Generation loves the cousin more than it loves him.
Yes.
Monkey, the dog, gets taken away by the girls.
Yeah.
That was a little heartbreaking.
That was a little sad.
Yeah. And I think this aging Keanu, this December Keanu, and we use December in this case because it involves relationships, consensual or not, involves relationships. We did play with the idea of calling him aging Keanu, which just felt a little too on the nose and lazy. But as we fast forward to John Wick, the whole character is built around the death of the dog.
Yeah.
So to come back to this cliche story of masculinity, he has this massive life in John Wick, and Bob and I will talk about John Wick Keanu next time on the other side of John Wick 3. The death of that dog and the death of his wife, right? Because the wife dies, and then she has a dog delivered posthumously, and so then the dog gets killed, which is what draws him back into this world. December Keanu and aging Keanu has a unique relationship with animals that we have not seen before.
Oh, that's really interesting.
And I think there's something to be said there, that as he ages, he's finding more things to love. And I feel like that's a beautiful piece of maturity.
That is really interesting. And one of the core elements of vulnerability comes from love, right? So the things that you love make you vulnerable. The things that you care deeply about make you vulnerable. And for the male, the classic heroic male narrative, right? The only thing that they are allowed to love is their wife. Their wife.
Oh yeah,
right?
and their wife.
Right. Like the wife and the kid, and then they've got the dad, right? Because they were too young to not have the daddy issues in the beginning. But to love an animal is typically something that is viewed, I think, more in the realm of the female, of the feminine. To have that relationship with an animal, it's really interesting to bring that, because that's one more level of vulnerability. That's one more level of a softening of this heroic male narrative that we have, especially as we get into this older space, right? I like that.
Yeah. How do these two films work together to establish Keanu as a public figure? How do they complement each other, and how do they confront each other? And I think we've gotten at a lot of this throughout our conversation, but especially since if you were not like following the Keanu blogs, you might not have even ever heard of these films.
I hadn't.
I hadn't either. Actually, I was going through the oeuvre systematically to see, but I did have one of my colleagues ask me, have you ever seen Knock Knock? It's this weird ass movie about these two like gorgeous young women who show up and like tie him up. And I was like, oh, that sounds intriguing. So having not watched these before, and the fact that this is kind of out of the public conversation of Keanu, how did these two films work together for you? And to be honest, just not even the public, how did this change your understanding of Keanu watching these two films back to back?
There is a very specific effect that these films had, which I called the Etch-a-Sketch Keanu. That it's like he does these things that are so outside of his standard kind of way of doing things. He'll pick something that is so weird and so different and so not what I expect from him, especially because his big films are the ones that I'm more familiar with. So the idea that I had of Keanu before going into these movies was just different. And so it feels like an Etch-a-Sketch that has been shook, and you can see some ghost lines, but it just is like a clean slate. And so it feels to me like it's almost, I had this thing like the anti-Keanu, but there is no anti-Keanu because
Keanu
everything
is the
is
anti-Keanu.
Everything is Keanu. Keanu is everything. He can do anything. He opens up this space where there is nothing that is off the table for him. There's nothing that's off brand for him. He is just simply Keanu, and he'll do whatever the hell he wants to do. Whatever interests him and whatever intrigues him, he'll go and do. And so I found that really interesting, that it just shook clear whatever boundaries I'd had in my mind of what he was, what defines him, and gave me this free space where he can be anything. Just sketch it out, whatever the next thing is, and then shake it up and do another one. What did you think?
I enjoyed him. I enjoyed both of these films. Coming to them after, what are we on? Episode 10. So, 20 some odd Keanu movies. I know that I believe last time I said explicitly Keanu's brand is off-brand.
Yes.
Right? That he delights in scuttling your expectations. Oh, are you expecting this? Well, I'll give you a little of this, but then I'm going to give you this over here.
Yeah.
And, I'm going to go on the circuit and I'm going to endorse this Veritas film that really doesn't begin till like 45 minutes into the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I didn't really feel that it changed the way I thought about it. And this is our base question. How would you like people to talk about Keanu given this in his body of work? How does it affect the public understanding of Keanu? The fact that people have not seen this, the fact that it has 0 on Rotten Tomatoes, I think is a demonstration that people want the Keanu they think they know.
Yeah.
And if you are not going to give me the Keanu that I think I want, then I don't like the Keanu you're going to give me, even though you're giving me you. And this is the inherent nature of celebrity, right? If you don't do what I'm expecting you to do, your name is garbage and you've been terrible. So what I would like for people to think, or how, if these movies were more popular, I think, just as you said, we would give Keanu more leeway, right? When I talk to people about this, I'm like, have you ever seen My Own Private Idaho? No, right? Because that was indie, small market, queer cinema, when queer cinema was not mainstream. It was another 15 years before we got to Brokeback, right?
Yeah.
So, he's playing in these spaces and we don't give him credit for playing in these spaces, even when it comes up terrible. Because I'm not saying that I disagree. I don't think Keanu can do anything. Let me rephrase that. I think he can. He absolutely can. Do I think he excels at everything? No. Do I appreciate his willingness to do everything? Yes. I personally think he is the hardest working man in show business. He is dedicated. He's going to do something he's never done before. Last time we talked about Kyle Keanu and his directorial debut, he directs an entire movie in Chinese. When have you ever seen an American star turned director direct a film in a foreign language that he doesn't speak?
Yeah.
that's mind-blowing. That's Keanu. So, you know, I also would love if people who love Keanu, people who go to see the movies, who put their butts in chairs, give Keanu their 2 hours. I'm glad I watched Generation I'm glad I watched Knock Knock, primarily because these are films I never would have watched if they didn't have Keanu Reeves in them. So he's taking his star power and saying, please, look at this story. Please, look at these people, right? And that's how I kind of want to talk about Keanu. That's how I want the public to see Keanu, which is as a conduit for stories, as a conduit for the human existence. And, you know, I hope we get to that point where we can see Keanu as more than just a movie star, as a whole person. Having said that, I think now he's publishing books as well.
Awesome.
So he's just not writing. I think he's publishing. So again, these are the stories that I think deserve to be printed and sold. Here you go.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, I think I appreciate him more watching these two films and seeing his directorial debut, because it adds to his impact on society and culture, which is the whole purpose of a star study.
Yeah.
How does Keanu impact society and culture?
Right. And I think that if Keanu was the kind of star that would follow the give the people what they want, you know, kind of mode, that you wouldn't see nearly the level of like interesting choices. And yes, are they all good? No. I think they're all interesting. I would absolutely say they're all interesting. And I want to say that interesting, I think, is better than good. I think interesting brings up a conversation like this. You know, we can have these talks. We can talk about these things. But the thing that I love about Keanu is that I don't know if the man feels fear, but he does not display fear. He goes and does these things and throws himself into them. And if they are, quote unquote, on brand for Keanu, which what is on brand for Keanu now is my complete idea of what is Keanu, what is defined as Keanu is completely shot by, you know, listening, because I have been a big fan of this whole series with you and Bob. I've been following you guys all the way through, hearing these conversations about these movies and what a wide range of things he does, you know. He's got his rock band. He does now apparently book publishing, which I did not know, and that's fascinating. So I love the fact that he does not exhibit the same kind of fear of response that a lot of creatives will do, especially once they've had a certain level of success. How do I replicate this traditional value of success, which is money and numbers and all of that kind of stuff? Most people go and chase that. And what he's chasing, I think, you know, from what I can tell, is chasing an experience instead, you know, a creative experience, that he's going to do something, and it may not always be great, it may not always work, but I think it's always going to be interesting, and I love him for that.
Well, thank you so much, Lani, for joining me to talk about these two movies. I'm sure I would have had a lovely conversation with Bob, but I am excited to have had this conversation with you.
Well, thank you. I enjoy so much. And as I will always continue to do, I will try to horn on everything you do, because I just love sitting down and talking about this stuff with you. It is so much fun. And I missed Bob, but it was really fun to have this time with you. So thank you so much for having me on the show.
So can you tell our listeners where they can find more of your podcasts or any particularly interesting projects you've got going on at the moment?
Yeah, you can find me at chipperish.com. That is where the home of Chipperish Media is. I have a number of shows that I'm doing at the moment, but one of the things that I'm doing right now is Welcome to the End Times, a podcast about good omens on Amazon Prime, starring David Tennant and Michael Sheen doing the Neil Gaiman, Terry Pratchett book Good Omens. So that's really fun. We've got podcasts about the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I've got Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I've got How Story Works, which is my narrative theory podcast, which is basically my college class in podcast form. So that's been
and I
really
assume
fun
it's a
to
little
do.
bit cheaper.
It's a lot cheaper. You don't get the credits or the grades, but you get the knowledge, and that's really what matters. So all of that stuff can be found at chipperish.com, and you can find me at Lani Diane Rich on Twitter.
Excellent. Thank you, Lani, for guest producing this episode today. And as always, thank you to Lizzie Goldsmith, whose credit will be editor on this episode. And I think I want to close with this one quote from Generation which technically encapsulates the movie, but I also think encapsulates the complexity of the conversation we've been having. And that is, shit don't mean shit unless it means shit. And it only means shit if you need it to mean shit. We'll see you next time.